Hi everyone, welcome to our very first lecture of the semester. I am your instructor this semester. If you haven't already watched my introduction video, I encourage you to watch it. But I would like to start off by saying I am so excited to get the semester started. And we're going to start by just kind of introducing you to the category and the topic of child development. So let's go ahead and start with some of the underlying principles. So I will post the PowerPoint each week, but you'll have this to go along with the video as well. So the first principle of development or understanding about development is that development is a lifelong process. In this class in particular, we're going to only cover from conception all the way until adolescence, but we have this general understanding that development occurs across the lifespan, so all the way until death. Another underlying principle of development is that development is multi-directional, which means while we can see growth in one area, we might also simultaneously see decline in a different area, or sometimes even in the same domain. For example, I think of brain development. So there is a point where we as children start to grow in our ability to say more words, understand more words, but at the same time, we lose the ability or decline in our ability to differentiate between different sounds from different languages, especially if we're not exposed to those languages anymore. So that's something to think about as an example of the fact that development is multi-directional. Development is also multidimensional. And what that means is that there is development and growth and change occurring in several different domains simultaneously. So the domains covered in our class together and in your textbook are the physical domain, the cognitive domain, and the social and emotional domain. So for the physical domain, we're specifically looking at physical changes in the body. So height, weight, we're looking at the ability to do different skills, gross motor and fine motor skills, which those words are going to become more familiar to you, I promise, throughout the semester. When we're looking at cognitive growth, we're looking at brain growth. We're looking at the child's ability to think about what they're doing, to understand why they're doing it. We're also going to look at the process of logic, and we're going to look at actual physical brain growth and connections as well in this class. And then when we look at social and emotional development, those are two separate domains, but your book covers them in one chapter or one area. So when we look at social development, we're looking at how the child grows in their ability to connect with others. And then when we're looking at emotional development, we're looking at their ability to first identify, second, express, and then third, also share their emotions with others. So those are the three different domains that your book covers. So again, cognitive, physical, and social and emotional, that's lumped together. And you'll see through our semester, each kind of section of development or period of development covers each category. So you're going to look at physical development in infancy, and then cognitive development in infancy, and then social and emotional development in infancy. So you'll go through those domains in each period of development. When we look at development is multi-contextual, we're looking at the fact that children and individuals don't develop in a silo or in a bubble. We develop with influences from all over. We develop from our environmental influences, and then we also develop based on our biological influences. And we'll talk about that in a second when we look at nature and nurture. So those are the underlying principles of development or underlying understandings of development. So now let's go and start talking about periods of development. So what we know about periods of development is that they are socially constructed. And what that means is that there's not a universal understanding of periods of development or an agreement upon when those periods of development occur. So we have a very westernized view of how periods of development happen and when they happen. But there are certain indigenous cultures who actually have 3 periods of development. So it's birth to walking, and then walking to adulthood, and then adulthood to death. And so it really is, it depends on a lot on culture, where you are in the world. That's why it's called the social construct, because society really constructs what it means to be in a period of development. As we look at children in the United States, we're looking at Western industrial society's views on developmental periods. So we look at 5 different stages. The first one is before birth, so prenatal development. The second one is infancy and toddlerhood. So we're talking about birth to 2 years old. And then the third one is early childhood, so 3 to 5 years old, middle childhood, 6 to 11 years old, and adolescence, 12 years to, and then we say adolescence, but we're looking at early 20s, really. So we're going to go through all of those periods of development in a lot more detail throughout the semester, but this is just an overview and introduction. Okay. Now let's look at some of the issues or some of the debates happening in the field of child development. The first one you might be familiar with. So for a long time, there was always these back and forths, these debates, these arguments. No, nature has more of an influence. No, nurture has more of an influence. And it's back and forth and back and forth. And people were thinking, you know, the environment from which you come from and where you're raised, that has more influence than your biology or the genes that you were born with. And so up until, you know, pretty recently, we were saying nurture versus nature, which one has more of an influence? And now, as there have been more studies completed, we now know that it's not nurture versus nature, it is nature and nurture. So both contribute to the growth and development of a child or of a person. Okay. Continue. Another issue or point of contention among developmental theorists is the idea of whether development is continuous or discontinuous. And so when someone says that development is continuous, they're looking at quantitative changes. And we're going to look at quantitative versus qualitative analysis in a second. But when I look at quantitative, I think quantity. So you can actually see the consistent change. You can measure it. It's numerical. You can measure the difference between stages of development. So quantitative changes. And we also know that the theorists who consider themselves continuous theorists, they believe that later behaviors are predicted based on earlier behaviors. So we can see where a child is going to end up based on what they're able to do right at this moment. A lot of the behavioral theorists that we're going to cover in this chapter were continuous theorists. They were also joined by other theorists like Vygotsky and information processing theorists who also thought that, you know, the world can kind of shape that continuous process. So we have some control over where the child ends up by what we input in that child early in life. The discontinuous stage or the discontinuous theory of development is also known as the stage theory of development. And you're going to see several stage theorists in this chapter. And what they're looking at is qualitative changes. So what did the child do before? And they have to be able to do this before they're able to do that. So you can kind of see how the different abilities look different at each stage. So it's not one thing that just grows and develops. It's one thing that changes into the next thing. So it says development occurs in stages and steps cannot be skipped. So you can't just get from a baby to an adult. You have to go from an infant to early childhood to middle childhood to adolescence. So there's stages that must occur in order to get to that final stage. And it also says development only proceeds positively. So it doesn't really give any validation to the fact that development can also be discontinuous or can also be also decline in some areas as it's growing in other areas. Some of those stage theorists we're going to cover are Freud, Erikson, and Piaget. So now let's start looking at some theorists, and let's look at that last kind of issue in child development. So another thing to consider is development active or is it passive? Are children active in the changes that occur as they grow, or are they passive receptacles of influences? So there are active developmental theorists and there are passive developmental theorists. So passive developmental theorists typically follow more of the behaviorist lens. Theorists like Jacques Rousseau and theorists, other behavioral theorists also believed that they could impart some kind of influence on how the child develops. In fact, Rousseau says that children are born noble savages. So they are born ready for the world to impart their knowledge upon them, and they can either get better and grow into wonderful adults, or they can be horrible human beings, but they are passive in that they don't have anything to kind of counter all of the influences that the world is putting on them. So he says noble savages is what he refers to children as. We're also looking at theorists such as Piaget. So this is Jean Piaget, and he says that children are actively exploring the world around them. So they're looking at how they can influence their own learning. They're seeking out knowledge, they're seeking out influence, they're seeking out relationships and interactions. And so he really gave children a lot more credit in how they develop and in the part they play in how they develop, which is pretty neat. All right, so let's continue. Now, when we look at quantitative research, when we look at research in general, we're going to look at quantitative and qualitative research. So the first one, quantitative research, we're looking at numbers. And when we think of quantitative research, we're looking at research that is a little bit easier to measure because it's based on the scientific method. And because it's based on the scientific method, we're looking at controlled settings. So we have the ability as the scientist, as the researcher, to control the variables so that we can get the most accurate result from that study. It's a way to be really objective in what we're measuring. So objective research comes from really being able to share an understanding. So if it's like we're looking like through a video camera, and if I watch this video camera and you watch this video camera, we're seeing the same thing because we're seeing it happen over and over. When it's subjective, we're going in looking for something, and it's that whole motto, what you seek you will find. And so that's where we're making judgment statements about what we're seeing. So instead, let's give you this example. So an objective observation would be the child is running. A subjective observation would be the child is running fast. My interpretation of fast and your interpretation of fast can be completely different. And so it's more subjective. But if we both are looking at this video and we see that the child is running, we can agree on that. But when we start to put those judgment statements on, or we start to make more of a qualitative analysis, then we're losing some of that objectivity. Okay. Let's continue. And let's look at qualitative research. So qualitative research tends to be a little bit more open-ended because you could do you have a lot more range in the type of studies that you can conduct. So you can also conduct this research in everyday settings. So you don't need that cold laboratory setting in order to conduct your research. You could go and observe a child at a playground, or go and observe, a classroom setting. You don't need to control the variables. It's also our interpretation of non-numerical data. So we're looking at the nature of the experiences instead of the quantity of the experiences. Also looking at the quality of the experiences. So we're looking at the how, but what we're missing from qualitative research is the why. So we don't really get a lot of the why in qualitative research. It's a lot more informal, so it tends to be a little less subjective and a little more subjective, but you still get a lot of rich data from qualitative research. Let me scroll down. Now let's look at the different settings in which research can be conducted. So there's naturalistic observations, and then there's laboratory observations. And we touched on it a little bit when we looked at qualitative research, but I want to go through it a little bit more. So when we're thinking about observing children, what do you think would be the best setting to observe children in? A naturalistic setting or a laboratory setting? If you said a naturalistic setting, you would be right. So the naturalistic setting is where you're going to get the most information. Why? Because the child is comfortable, the child is surrounded by people and things that they're familiar with. We don't have to modify the environment at all. And it's real life for them. So they're more likely to engage fully in whatever we're trying to pull out from them. So it's very highly preferred for early childhood. Whereas in a laboratory setting, we can control the environment. So if we're looking at how children respond to temperature changes, we can create those temperature changes. We're looking at how children respond to different people. We can control who comes in and out of the room. Whereas in those naturalistic observations, we cannot control those things. We can't control if a TV is on, if we're doing an observation in the home. We can't control if the phone rings. We can't control if the child slept before we got there. So those are things that we wouldn't be able to control. Whereas in a laboratory observation, we might have a little bit more control over that. It's also really important to pay attention to any bias that the observer might have. For example, I found that the more work that I've done with children with unique needs, now I can see unique needs in every child that I'm observing. So I have to be very careful about how my experiences have formed biases in different observations that I'm making. Okay. Let's look at other types of studies. So there is a difference between correlational studies and causational studies. So correlational studies are looking at a relationship between two variables. And so we're looking at if one positively increases, or if one negatively decreases. So an example of positively increases is the more violent television watched, the more aggressive the child is. We know that that is actually not as true as we once thought it was, but we're looking at the correlation. Violent television might not cause aggression in a child, but we can see that those two variables are increasing at the same time. Whereas one negatively decreases. So the more education, the less dementia. So we know that education doesn't decrease dementia, but we are able to see that when one is going up, the other is going down. So they're correlated. There's a relationship between them, but it's not a causal relationship. So it helps us to kind of predict an outcome. Now let's look at another form of research. Case studies. So case studies are really neat and one of the things that I probably have the most experience with when it comes to research, because we're looking at one person or one family. And why I like them so much is because we get so much data from these kinds of studies. We can really go in depth with what we're observing. We can get information about the family or the child's belief system, their cultural influences, their environmental influences. So it's a great way to get a lot of information. The downside is we're only looking at one person or one family. So we can't say, well, because this happened with this family, it's true for all families. That would mean it was generalizable. So if we were able to say, if we had a bigger sample size, we could say, this is probably true of most children. But because we just have one child or one family, we can't say, well, this is true for all children. So it's not generalizable, but it does give us a lot of really great information. Another way to conduct research is through surveys. So you're all probably very familiar with surveys. All have done at least one survey in your life. And we know that they're popular because computers, they could take surveys in person. Really, phones now, you can do surveys in so many different capacities that it's easy to get a lot of people to complete your survey at one time. So that's why they're so popular. When you use a survey, there's a few things that are important to consider. The first one is the Likert scale. So a Likert scale is like a 1 through 5 scale, or a strongly agree to strongly disagree scale. And a person chooses where they feel like they most relate to whatever your question is on that scale. And then you can run some information based on the responses that you get. If you're doing a Likert scale, it's important to really be thoughtful as to what questions you're asking, because you want to get good, rich information. And if you aren't asking the right questions, you're not going to end up with efficient answers. So something to consider. Those are just a few different ways to conduct research. And now let's look at some methods. So there's different kinds of studies, and in your textbook, it talks about 3 specific types of studies and some pros and cons to each. So you're going to read about longitudinal studies, cross-sectional studies, and sequential studies. So longitudinal studies are really valuable because you're looking at one group of children across a long period of time. But as you can imagine, it's really hard to keep track of those same children or those same subjects for 5, 10, 20 years doing research. People move away, people lose contact, people change their phone numbers, people just lose interest. And so it's really hard to keep those same participants throughout a longitudinal study. A cross-sectional study, on the other hand, some advantages to that is that you automatically have children of different ages at the same time. So in the same study, you're going to have a group of 2-year-olds, a group of 4-year-olds, and a group of 6-year-olds. And then you can look at them at different points of time. So it's kind of a combination of different research methods. What's really kind of difficult is that you're not getting the same kind of information, because sometimes something can happen called the cohort effect. So it's really difficult to see if the information you're gaining is because of changes in how each different age group perceives the topic at that one time, or if we're seeing genuine differences between the age. So is age the factor, or is it environmental factors? Is it cultural factors? Is it time factors? So it really is hard to determine if what you're studying is really influencing the results or not. Sequential methods examine changes within individuals over time. What's really kind of nice about this, but presents the same difficulties as the longitudinal study, as it's really, really hard to keep track of all of those different cohorts across a long period of time. And it's also really expensive to do that. So if you have a group A, group B, group C, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and then you're looking at all those groups for 5 years, you have to keep track of all those families for all those 5 years, which is really challenging. So those are just a few different types of research methods. And now let's look at theory. So you cannot have practice without theory. And because child development is a scientific field, we have to understand what a theory is. So a theory is a very valuable way to understand human behavior. What's wonderful about a theory is that it gives kind of an idea or a thought about, well, I think this happens because of this. And so when you make a statement like that, you're theorizing about why something happens in development. What it's important to notate is that theories are not facts. The actual thing that makes a theory is that it could be researched, and there are attempts to disprove the research all the time, and disprove the theory all the time. And so it's really important to know that this is one person or a group of people's idea about how a child develops. So it's not the only idea of how a child develops, but it is one researched theory about how a child develops. So theories are guidelines for investigation and practice. So if we know, like once we look at all these theorists, and let's say we know Erikson talks about that a young child needs to be able to trust in order to establish healthy relationships as they get older, then we can make theories about what impacts a trusting relationship between an infant and their attachment figure. So we can create some understandings and some ideas about how that happens. And how theories gain credibility is that over time they continue to be researched, and people continue to try to discredit them and disprove them. And when they fail to disprove them, it gives even more validity and credibility to that theory. Like, oh, well, I haven't been able to prove you wrong, so I guess you must still be pretty accurate in your theory about how children develop. So let's look at some of these theorists. So the first type of theory that we're going to look at are psychoanalytic theorists. And the two big names in this type of theory is Freud and Erikson. But as similar as they are in their understanding of children, there are some pretty distinct differences, and we're going to look at some of those differences right now. So we're going to start with Freud, good old Freud. So if you have studied psychology at all, or even just an everyday conversation, I'm sure Freud has come up. And Freud's theory is known as the psychosexual theory, and also as the theory of self. And what sets Freud apart from Erikson is that Freud really looked at how different experiences in early childhood really affect development and outcomes in adulthood. So he thinks everything that happens in early childhood, it can be the reason why you are the way you are as an adult. Where Erikson, as we're going to see in a second, he really sees development as more of a continual over the lifespan kind of influence. So you can have multiple influences throughout your lifespan where you shape and mold who you are throughout your life. So again, Freud is early influences impact later development, where Erikson is more of a lifelong development kind of person. So let's go back to Freud. So he has stated that there are three hypothetical parts of the personality. He talks about the id, the ego, and the superego. And there are different timings of when these three different things develop. So the id is present right at birth, and it is guided by pleasure, instant gratification. We're looking at biological needs, and this is why we see it at birth. This is why a child cries when they're hungry, and that's why they scream when they're tired. It's why they if they feel like pooping in their diaper, they poop in their diaper because they are controlled by what feels good in their body, according to Freud. Now, as they get older, let's actually look around the 5 to 6-year-old, the superego develops. And this is when they're guided by guilt. So this is kind of conscious thought. Should I do this? Should I not do this? This is really influenced a lot by culture. It's influenced a lot by social dynamics. So they're learning, oh, I really want to throw a tantrum right now. My super ego is telling me that I'll be really embarrassed if I throw a tantrum right now at 5 and 6 years old. And the ego is actually the part of the personality that mediates the id and the superego. So, for example, it's the reason why we as adults, well, most of us as adults, it's the reason why when we're hungry in a classroom or in the middle of the store, we don't throw ourselves on the floor and throw a tantrum, because our superego says, that's not socially acceptable anymore. You probably shouldn't do that. I know you're hungry, but let's wait a little bit and then you can have a snack later. So really guided by logic and by reality. So as we get older, we become better. Our ego matures at the ability to mediate between the id and the superego. So Freud, and before I go into Freud stages, there's some fun things to know about Freud. First of all, he did a lot of cocaine. Second of all, he really got a lot of his theory about how children develop by being a psychologist of middle-aged women. So he really didn't study children too much, but in the patients that he studied, he derived common themes about their childhood experiences, which led him to these theories. So let's look at these different stages in his theory, knowing what you know now. So his first stage is from birth to 12 months, and it's called the oral stage. And in the oral stage, children are driven by a need of oral fixation. So they're needing to either nurse or have a pacifier or put things in their mouth. So they're driven a lot by that oral sensation. And what Freud says is if you don't get enough, or so if you get too little or too much of anything in these stages, it's going to impact you for life. So in the oral stage, he says, if you don't get enough oral sensation as that 0 to 12-month-old, then you actually can become hyper-focused on that. If you've ever heard of the term anal retentive or oral fixation. So if you are the person who bites their pencil all the time, or you are the person who always needs to be chewing gum, Freud would say, oh, you probably didn't get enough of that when you were an infant or when you were that birth to 12-month-old stage. And the anal retentive thing is until this next stage, the 12-month to 3-year stage. And he calls it the anal stage. And what are children doing between 12 months to 3 years? They're learning how to toilet train. And so during this stage, he states that children are really going through this age where they're really kind of obsessed with things kind of coming out of them. And if you toilet train a child too early, that's when that anal retentive thing can happen, where you have to always have everything really, really neat and orderly. But if you toilet train too late, then you can end up like a really messy person. So he had an interesting theory about what happens if you don't get appropriate needs met during that anal stage. And then this third stage she calls the phallic stage, and that's the 3 years to 6 years old. And this is when he states that children are really starting to put an emphasis on cultural perceptions of femininity and masculinity. And he did go based on a binary system because that was his understanding at that time. And so he also came up with really off the wall theories that are interesting to think about. And if you ever take a psychology class, you'll probably be really interested in that as well. But he used to say that children in this age group, young girls, used to have something known as penis envy, where they were just really upset because at their fathers because they really wish they had a penis, and it's pretty far out there. Boys actually were jealous of their fathers because they loved their mothers, and so they had that dynamic where they became competitive with the male figure in their life. So you can tell that this is very, very old science. But it's interesting to consider some of the things that he was talking about for studying these things such a long time ago. And then the next stage is the latent period of development. And this is 6 years to puberty. And this is when Freud says, well, now, that the young children are making up with their same-sex parent, and they no longer, have any kind of sexual thoughts or penis envy or anything like that. And now their focus is on friendship. So they're looking at building relationships. They're looking at how to be social in peer groups. And then the next stage is the genital stage, which is puberty through adulthood, where their main focus is on procreation and intimacy. So that's Freud's psychosexual theory in a nutshell. And again, he's a little off the wall, but we take a lot of things from his theory, and he really had a lot of students that studied under him that you're going to see throughout the different chapters in the semester. So that's Freud. Super interesting, I know. And then the next one is Erikson. So Erikson's psychosocial theory is one that I probably find a lot of connection with, because it's just interesting to see so many examples of his theory in my work with children. And you might see some examples as you learn more about him as well. So he was known as the father of developmental psychology. And he looked at 8 specific stages across a lifespan. And within these 8 stages, he said that individuals go through what he called identity crises. And in order for individuals to come out with a healthy outcome of these crises, they needed to have a healthy dose of each of the conflicting qualities. So I'll have you look at what these different conflicts are. And then he said, the healthy outcome is a virtue that you get at the end of it. So the first one is trust versus mistrust, and we're looking at birth to about 1.5 years here. And think about what children are doing here and maybe some of the misconceptions that you may have heard. For example, if you hold a child too much, you can spoil them. If you respond to their every cry, that you can spoil them. And then they'll just cry all the time. But if we look at Erikson's theory, he actually says, well, this is when children are learning how to trust. And so it's important to respond to them, but also to support them in appropriate self-soothing. So it's, again, that balance of children need to know that they can trust us to respond when they need us, because remember, they're pretty codependent at this time. They really can't do anything on their own yet, and they need us for a lot as the adults. So if they have that balance between trust versus mistrust, they end up with the virtue of hope. The next one is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And if you look again at the age where this conflict is taking place, it's 1.5 to 3 years old. And again, like in Freud's stage, what are children doing during this stage? They're toilet training. And so they're trying to do a lot more by themselves. And if we toilet train too early, or if we're harsh in our corrections when children are trying to be independent, they might get too much of that shame and doubt and not enough autonomy. So they're not going to want to do more things because they feel like they can't. They're doubting themselves, or they feel so shamed in their correction that they don't want to try. So if they have a balance between autonomy versus shame and doubt, they have the virtue of will. Now, the next one is initiative versus guilt. Now, the 3 to 6 year old stage is when children are maybe starting preschool or TK, or some children even kindergarten and first grade. And what they're trying to do is they're now learning, oh, hey, okay, I can do some of these things by myself. I'm going to try more things. I'm going to take that initiative. And if I'm allowed or given more responsibilities, I can really start to see that I have a purpose. Now, if I instead am feeling guilty that I can't do a lot of these things on my own, then I won't get that virtue of purpose. Now, the next stage is industry versus inferiority. And this is that 6 to 12 year old stage. And this is when children are, starting to be around peers a lot more. They're starting to compare themselves to each other. They're starting to find their strengths and weaknesses. And it really is our responsibility as the adults to not only support them in trying new things, but to support them in building up their confidence and also being realistic about what they're good at and what they're not good at, right? Not all children are good at everything, and no one's good at everything. So it's important for children to understand that, and the virtue that Erikson says that they will possess if they have a balance between industry and inferiority is they will gain skill. Now, the next stage is identity versus identity confusion. And we're looking at 12 years to young adulthood. And when we're looking at this age group, this is typically when children are, ending middle school, starting to get into high school. And what are they trying to do? Who are they around more than anyone? Their peers. And so their peers have a huge influence on them, and they're trying to figure out who they are. So they might experiment with how they look. They might experiment with their interests. This is really a stage in their development where they're really coming into their own and really trying to know their identity and be confident in their identity. And if they are met with support and understanding and empathy, then they have this virtue of fidelity. Now, the next stage is intimacy versus isolation. And remember, we go all the way through adulthood with Erikson, even though in this class we only go through adolescence. I'm going to go through the rest of the stages too. So for young adulthood, this intimacy versus isolation, we're looking at the connections that we're making with other, not just romantic intimacy, but friendship intimacy, sharing emotions, sharing space. Um, it's interesting now doing this lecture after 2.5 years in the pandemic, and seeing how much the isolation that people have experienced in COVID has affected the stage of Erikson's development is really interesting, because the isolation has really impacted feelings of loneliness, feelings of uh, worth, feelings of anxiety. It's interesting to see the changes that have been made because of that time in isolation. But if there's a balance, then that virtue is love. And then the next two, both generativity versus stagnation, and then integrity versus despair, are middle adulthood and late adulthood confronting death. So I won't go into too much detail in those two because we don't cover them too much in our class. So now let's look at behaviorist theorists. So specifically, we're going to look at Pavlov, Skinner, and Watson. And so let me talk about them a little bit more. So in your reading, you're going to learn about Pavlov and his classical conditioning, specifically Pavlov's dogs. So what he learned through his studies is that at a certain time, the dogs that he was feeding would start to drool before they even got fed. And he said, I mean, it's not right. It's not normal. How do they know it's coming? And then he realized that it was his footsteps taking them the food that was a stimulus to that response, that drooling response. So he had conditioned the drooling, conditioned the response in those dogs. So it made him think, oh, can I use something else to condition? Can I use something else as the stimulus to that response? And so he started ringing a bell, and he recognized that the dog started to associate the bell with food. And so they would start drooling as soon as they heard the bell. So when he is looking at classical conditioning, it's really interesting because both he and Watson were pretty well admired in the parenting world, because parents were using some of this classical conditioning as a way to get their children to behave by instilling fear, which is interesting and a little scary and pretty sad, but the truth nonetheless that parents were using this classical conditioning model in their parenting structure. So Pavlov used his dogs. Watson was super unethical and used a child. So he did what were called the Little Albert experiments. And with little Albert, what he wanted to see is if he could condition a fear response in children in something that they weren't fearful of before. So what he did was he knew that on sight, this child wasn't scared of white rabbits or a white beard or any of the things on sight that he was showing Albert. But what he did know that auditorily children would startle. They have a startle reflex. So he started associating a loud noise anytime he would present a visual stimulus. So he would bring out a white rabbit and then make a really loud, scary sound. And of course, little Albert would cry. And so what he did was he started to figure out that he could condition fear now without even the loud noise. Anytime that the child saw not only a white rabbit, but also anything white. So white beards, white paper, just anything that resembled that initial visual stimulus, the child would be terrified. And so it's interesting that he went out and spoke about that as a selling point for getting children to listen. So if you don't want your child to touch the stove, make a really loud noise every time they touch the stove, and then they'll be terrified to touch the stove. Will do anything for a relationship built on trust. So an interesting thing about classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is Skinner. So pay no mind to that. That was a typo. But he looked at reinforcement and punishment. So he thought it's not what you do before to stimulate that response, it's what you do afterwards that really can influence whether a child or a person continues that behavior or discontinues that behavior. We're probably most familiar with operant conditioning because let's think of reinforcement. We have a lot of reinforcers in our world. Grades are a reinforcer. When you get an A, you feel good. It's an extrinsic reinforcer, and so you're more likely to do the same kind of work so you can get an A again. Candy, it's probably my least favorite reinforcer for children. My favorite reinforcer as an adult, but when children do something good and they get a candy, that's a reinforcer. When they listen and then they get a sticker, that's a reinforcer. So that's a positive reinforcement. A negative reinforcement isn't what it sounds like. It sounds like something bad, but it's actually something positive. So a negative reinforcement is actually taking something undesired away as like a prize for doing what you wanted somebody to do. So for example, you got straight A's, I'm going to take away your chores this week. So it's negative because you're taking it away, you're not giving them something, but it's still a reinforcement. So oftentimes people confuse negative reinforcement and punishment. Punishment is what we're probably most familiar with when it comes to spanking, or when it comes to grounding a child or timeout. Those are punishments. And if you follow Skinner's lead, he really feels strongly that that's how you get children to do what you want them to do. They're either motivated to continue or they're motivated to stop doing something you don't want them to do anymore. And what we know about current research shows that that might work in the immediate sense, but it's less likely to work over time. And it's also more strongly correlated with negative behaviors in the future and negative relationships. So something to consider. And also with behaviorism, I have Albert Bandura here because he's a social learning theorist. And even though he's not necessarily a behaviorist, he has a lot of behaviorist-like thinking. So he feels that children are more likely to do things when they get a positive reaction from others. So the reinforcement he's looking at is really the social reinforcement. So if I am a baby and let's say I clap my hands, the response that I get from the people around me, either, oh my gosh, you clapped your hands, yay! It's either going to encourage me to continue clapping or discourage me. So if everyone ignores me, I'm probably less likely to continue. But if people give me a lot of attention and I'm getting a lot of positive attention, I'm probably more likely to continue. So that's the social learning theory. This is probably one of my favorite examples of classical conditioning. So I'm going to be quiet so you can hear it, and then we'll talk about it.
reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid?
What do you think?
Dwight, want an Altoid?
Okay.
Altoid?
Sure.
What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
So what Jim was doing is he had conditioned Dwight to associate an Altoid with that sound that his computer was making. So even without Jim saying, do you want an Altoid? Just the sound, that stimulus was creating a response in Dwight to put out his hand, and then those physical responses followed. So I just thought that was a fun example of classical conditioning. Let's look at cognitive theory. So probably one of the most famous cognitive theorists is Piaget, and someone who you'll come across more and more throughout your education is Piaget. He looked at an emphasis on how children arrived at an answer. So not the answer itself, but the process that they engaged in order to get to that answer. He also looked at 4 qualitatively different stages. So he looked at the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. And you're going to look at each one of those in detail as you engage the semester. What we know about Piaget is he asked important questions, but he asked questions that really didn't give children the opportunity to show what they were fully capable of. So we now know that children can do a lot more than Piaget thought that they could do. He really functions as someone who believes growth occurs as a result of 3 interrelated processes, and I'm going to show you what these processes are. So he believes that children have organizations of information, which he refers to as schemas. And so each schema is an understanding of a different concept. And children add on to these schemas through a period of adaptation. So there are 2 different ways to adapt information. There's assimilation and accommodation. So the assimilation process is I'm going to take in new information. And then, because it might be conflicting information with their original understanding of something, they go through this period where they're striving for equilibrium. So they're saying, this doesn't connect. I'm not sure what to do. And so they go through a period of disequilibrium, and then they begin to slowly accommodate or modify their thinking in order to create a new schema or a new understanding. So that's kind of the cycle of understanding that Piaget states. The other cognitive theorist that's important to consider is Vygotsky. He's probably the theorist that I studied the most in my master's program. So I have a connection to Vygotsky. He's a sociocultural theorist, and so he was big on how culture influences children's development. He also has a strong tie to language and how language impacts cognition. So that's something to also consider as we learn about children's linguistic abilities. A couple of phrases that you're going to hear pretty often in the child development field are the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. The zone of proximal development is where Vygotsky says is the stage at which a child can, between the stages of where a child can do something independently and where they need a lot of support. So it's that stage where they can do something with moderate or minimal support from an adult. And so the goal is to scaffold them, so to provide a little bit, to provide support and slowly take away the support as the child gets better at that skill. So that's zone of proximal development and scaffolding. So if you're familiar with construction at all, this is scaffolding, right? So if you're building something, you have all of the scaffolding up, and as your structure comes together, you can start taking the scaffolding down because it can stand on its own now. Now let's look at contextual theorists. So Bronfenbrenner is probably the name that you're going to hear the most when it comes to systems theory. Vygotsky is also a contextual theorist, but not like Urie Bronfenbrenner. Bronfenbrenner is the guy for contextual theory. He looks at 5 interlocking systems, and I'm going to show you this chart here. So the child is at the center of these systems, and then you'll see the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystem, and these are all occurring within a chronosystem, which is time. So let's look at each of these systems pretty quickly. So the microsystem is where the child is developing their home, really. So their patterns of activities, the people around them, their personal relationships, the roles that they play in those families. So are they the oldest? Are they an only child? Their home life, where they live, the school that they go to, the neighborhood that they live in, that's all considered the child's microsystem. Now, the mesosystem is interesting because it looks at how do the child's microsystems interact with each other. So how does home interact with school? Does the family participate in school events? Do they attend open houses or parent-teacher conferences? How does the family interact with peer groups? Do they invite other children to birthday parties? Do they attend birthday parties? Do they attend other events in their community? So that's the mesosystem. The exosystem is a linkage between 2 or more settings, and this affects children indirectly, where the mesosystem directly affects the child. This is something like if a parent is working 16 hours a day, that parent is probably going to be stressed out and tired, which then might affect their relationship with their child, their interactions with their child, their ability to attend school functions, so that parents' mesosystem is going to indirectly affect their child's exosystem. So it also looks at the educational system, the transit system. So can the child take the bus to school? Are there shopping centers around there? Because that affects the environment in which the child's in as well. Also looking at mass media, religious hierarchy. These are all things that indirectly affect the child. Now, the macro system is really looking at the overarching cultural patterns. So what are the dominant values in the environment which the child is in? The beliefs, the customs, the political system, which is interesting right now, the climate, to look at how children are developing within the political climate, the current political climate, and economic systems. So the reason I have this picture here is I really look at how belief systems can change. So in one generation to another generation, the tradition of what's known as a quinceañera, the belief behind the quinceañera can change from one generation to the next generation. When they first started, it was really a way for villagers to show that their 15-year-old daughter was ready for marriage and children. Now, if I were to give my daughter a quinceañera, I would not want to let the village of Modesto know that my child is ready for marriage and children. So it's shifted and changed over the years. And speaking of over time, we're going to look at the chronosystem. So the chronosystem is time. Chrono, look at chronological, look at time. There are several changes that occur over time with children. They can move, parents can separate, a parent can lose employment. Look at the changes within health in the past 3 years, right? So you can go through a global pandemic and that's going to change development. So there are a lot of things that occur over time. And then lastly, your book doesn't cover this, but it's also important to consider evolutionary theorists like Wilson and Darwin. And when we look at evolution, we're looking at some of the changes that explain some of the survival and some of the characteristics that we see in young children and in even expecting parents or expecting people. Such as morning sickness. So Darwin would have said that morning sickness developed because expecting people needed to be weary of what they put in their bodies because they needed to protect that developing fetus. And so they would get sick to let their bodies know, hey, I need to be more careful about what I ingest. So those are just some introduction to these theorists. You're going to get to know a lot more information over the semester. So I hope you enjoyed this first lecture. I hope you come and see me when you have any questions. But other than that, have a great first week.